as much as many may mock, I like my Britney Spears glasses. And if she really did call you and want them back, I will absolutely give them back. But I bet she didn't call you. So what am I doing right now? I am going to go up to the P.O. box and pick up my mail. These are my kukui nuts. You're simply going to have to look at them. Actually, you know what? Here's what I'll do. Bop, 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 bop. There we go. Which brings me to a topic of the media. I was in the media for 20 years. I started in radio when I was 14, and I stopped when I was about 34, 35. My first radio show was at WMLN-FM, 91.5 FM, out of Curry College in Milton, Massachusetts, with a power of 100 watts. Back then, part of the sign-on and sign-off, you had to recite your city of license, the company who you were licensed to, your effective radiated power, ERP, your frequency, obviously, and your operating hours. And now, for the most part, it's just easier to keep radio stations running 24 hours a day. Turn the transmitter on and walk away. If you have to take it offline, it's a huge deal. Anyway, so how old was that when that was occurring? That would be 82. And then I worked there, and then had a brief, like, not working in radio, but always had a radio station, like, in my basement, so would always be practicing. And then when I got to college, my first university was University of Massachusetts, and we did not have an on-campus radio station. They had a radio station that was basically part of a kind of a public broadcasting service. It wasn't necessarily part of NPR. In fact, I know it wasn't part of NPR as far as an affiliate, but it was sort of a community-run radio station in the sense that it was supported by the community. It was very professional, and it wasn't college radio by any means. Then we decided to, a bunch of us got together and we said, okay, well, our campus, while not massive, the people that come here on campus are on campus like pretty much all day. Like, it's a full stint. Like, you just don't leave your dorm and go to class and then leave. You're in like one of 5 buildings pretty much all day long, because it was a commuter school. The University of Massachusetts has multiple campuses. I went to the Boston campus, which is right next to the Kennedy Library. And if you don't know, when you grow up in Massachusetts, the Kennedys, that entire family, it's basically like royalty. And so while you could, argue whether you're Democrat, Republican, fan of Kennedy, not a fan of Kennedy, or JFK, or Roberts, or whoever, the point is that when you grow up in Massachusetts, they're royalty. So anyway, the JFK Library, which is right across sort of this little body of water, very little in the sense that you just simply drive there from the parking structure. Anyway, so that was UMass Boston, and so we started an on-campus radio station called WOSR, On-Campus Student Radio. Yes, we were very creative. And I would do the mornings a couple days a week, and then it was kind of like a shared thing, so another buddy would do mornings a couple other times. When I was done with my shift, usually what I would do, or now that I think back, or maybe it was I would go in early before my shift, before we basically turned on and were broadcasting across the campus, and I would, and I would record promos. That's right, I know what they were. It was called What's Happening Weekly, and so I would get all this information from the local newspapers, so the Globe, the Boston Phoenix, and which actually I don't even know if that paper still exists. The Boston Globe absolutely exists, as well as the Boston Herald. And so I would read sort of the happenings that were coming up the following week. I would do this very early Monday morning before my shift started. And then that would be a promo, basically, that ran all day, every day, for 5 days. So it told you what was happening during the week, and then what was happening that weekend. And I think I used to do, it was about a 2-minute update, and I think we ran it like maybe once every one shift, so like once every 3 hours, once every 4 hours. So it was fun, actually, because it got me to know what was happening that week. And it was funny too. I mean, we didn't have like any editing equipment or anything like that, or tracks. So all I did was make sure that whatever was on the mixing console wasn't going out over the air, and I would use the on-air studio as my production studio, and I would do it in one take. I didn't have the ability to do it in 2 takes, and I would record it directly onto the tape that would play. The background music I always used for it was Frankenstein by the Edgar Winter Group. And I don't think the What's Happening Weekly updates were ever longer than 3 minutes. So I don't think that song is longer than 4 minutes. So anyway, that's how I started out in radio, basically volunteering my time. Now, I absolutely did get paid to be on the air when I was at Curry College, in the summers when I was there, simply because I was not a student, actually. But they didn't have, or I was just lucky, they didn't have students to fill all of the shifts, so I was able to pick up some shifts, and it was a great learning experience, and they would pay me minimum wage. And that was pretty awesome, because I honestly don't think, I think there were a couple of other students that were like, that they had the role of station manager, or music director, or program director of the station, and I think they were actually getting paid minimum wage as well, as a salary, as well as getting credits for it, because they would be going for a major of like broadcasting or media relations or that sort of thing. So anyway, so yeah, so I was doing that when I was in high school, and then WOSR at, and then I had this brief opportunity to work at WCLX, which was basically the classic rock station at the time in Boston. Absolutely a commercial radio station, very profitable. And back then, I mean, if you were in radio, you were a rock star. Actually, you weren't a rock star. You were playing with the rock stars. You were hanging out with the rock stars, but you were a star. If you were a DJ, you were a star. And I never made it on commercial radio in Boston. After 2.5 years at UMass Boston, I then moved out to San Diego, where I live now. And I transferred eventually to San Diego State University. I tried going to UCSD, because actually UCSD has a very good reputation all over the country. San Diego State really isn't that well known in Boston, at least it wasn't at the time. And I think even back then it was one of those like top 10 party schools, and so my mother was like, "What are you doing?" But actually I got a really good education. That's where I finished up my bachelor's in electrical engineering. And so when I was in San Diego, I had the opportunity to rebuild the entire on-campus student radio at San Diego State. Actually, let me back up. So my first radio gig in San Diego was at UCSD, and I think I had an overnight shift that I started out in, which I loved because it was the longest shift. Like usually shifts are like 3 hours or 4 hours. But the overnight shift was always like midnight to 6 a.m. Because if they could get one person to do it, that was a miracle. But I loved that shift, especially when I was getting paid. Because when I was getting paid, usually I was getting paid hourly. So I'd much rather get 6 hours worth of pay than 4 or 5 or 4 or 3 or 4. So that was kind of cool. So that was I don't remember what that was called, but I remember. But it was at UCSD, and the stations around here in San Diego, they didn't have the luxury of having a transmitter and having an actual frequency, because the frequencies to the south, less than, if you will, 91.9, those frequencies on the FM band are reserved for non-commercial / educational radio stations. So in every other part of the country, all the colleges would apply for a license for those frequencies, and they would get them. And they would be able to afford like a 100 watt or a 500 watt or 1,000 watt, but never like, you know, the big FM guys, like 10,000 watt transmitters, 30,000, 50,000, which are the big commercial guys. And so, you know, and that was great because there wasn't such a density of universities in most areas, such that each radio station couldn't have their own, you know, 100 to 500 watt radio station. So it was great. Every student got to have a real working radio station. Well, here in San Diego, because of our proximity, as well as other border cities, but specifically to San Diego, because of our proximity to Mexico, those frequencies are used up by the Mexican stations. And so the Mexicans, and actually the Americans being smart and knowing that the Mexicans didn't have that limitation on, you know, 89.7 up to 91.9 of being non-commercial, is they would go down there and through a Mexican company or Mexican families or friends or whatever, they would get a Mexican frequency between 89.5 or 87.9 rather, and 91.9, and they would go right across the border and put this huge antenna up and blast 100,000 watts of FM straight up the coast. And so some of you maybe have heard of that. There was the, in American Graffiti, right, the movie, the very old movie, certainly before my time actually. That was like an old movie by the time I first saw it. But in that was sort of the first national appearance, if you will, of Wolfman Jack. Robert Smith, if you don't know his real name, but Wolfman Jack, and there's a scene in it where basically he's broadcasting from Mexico. And in the movie it was fake, but in reality, one of his first radio shows actually was from this 100,000 watt AM station, which is insane. That is an enormous amount of AM power. The highest AM station you can have in the United States is 50,000 watts. And so, but they had these 100,000 watt, what we would refer to as flamethrowers, down in Mexico, and they were massively directional because, of course, you wouldn't spend all that money on electricity to send your frequency into Mexico because there was no ad revenue available there. So you would blast it across the U.S. border and straight up the coast, and AM travels differently, but for FM, it's what's referred to as line of sight. So they would go across the border in San Diego to the highest mountain in Tijuana, which is not that high. It's like 500-600 feet. Put a 200-foot stick, put a 200-foot tower on top of that. Get anywhere from a 12 to 15 bay, which would give your transmitter a gain of anywhere from 10x to sometimes 20x, and they would blast the FM station across the border, and the amount of power that comes out of your antenna when you put those additional, if you see their little like sticks, they're called bays, if you put those additional ones in there, that gives you amplification of your transmitter. So as an example, there is still a station just south of the border, XTRA-FM 91.9, which the world, or certainly around here, everyone knows as 91X. Wolfman Jack was on that briefly, and they use his voice as some drops to identify the station. So if you're listening in town every now and then, you'll hear 91X, baby. And so 91.1 was one of those flamethrowers. And so what they have is they have a 20,000 watt transmitter with a antenna that is directional, so it's not 180 degrees. It puts most of the power north up here into the United States. The thing reaches all the way to almost Los Angeles. And the gain, and it's got a 12 bay antenna which has a gain of over 6. So 6 times 20 is 120,000 watts effective radiated power. 100% illegal in the United States. But I've worked in radio here in San Diego, and we had and I worked at a Mexican station, and we had a transmitter across the border, and we were licensed for 50,000 watts. And I can tell you, as the engineer, I had that thing cranked up to 80,000 watts of effective radiant power. When I turned that transmitter on, the grass bent. We had like 4 extra air conditioners in the room to keep the transmitter on, and when I started there, we were at 50,000 watts. And within 1 year, I was able to tune the transmitter so it wouldn't be, you know, overheating or cause any electronic issues. It wouldn't overmodulate either. But we were at about 80,000, and I think there were some times when we were really just cranking it up there, and we were doing about 86,000 ERP, blasting that north. And I can tell you the reality is that our ratings increased because San Diego County is enormous, and at the time, the ratings books, or what they would refer to as the book, which was the ratings results that you would get as a station, those were determined by books that people would get, and they would fill out how they listened to radio over the course of several weeks. And as they fill it out, they would jot down what they do, similar to a diary, which is why they're called diaries. And so basically the Nielsen ratings and Arbitrends and Arbitron, what we would refer to if our ratings weren't good in radio as arbitrary at the time, we would get rated. And so since San Diego County is so large, with the power cranking, we would be able to have our signal much clearer further north. And so people that were north of Oceanside and that sort of thing, all the way up to Camp Pendleton, they would be able to listen to our radio station. So therefore they would, and then they would write it down in their book as listening to that. So they were listening to our station instead of the other ones that easily could reach them because they were broadcasting out of San Diego. That's where I spent the majority of my professional radio career, meaning I worked at one station for 6 years, which is a lifetime in radio. Any place you work for more than about 3 or 4 years in radio means that's a long-term relationship in a big way. I was also able to go on vacation and come back and not have my job taken away, which is the other joke about radio. Don't ever go on vacation to radio for 2 weeks, because especially if you're on the air, if you're a DJ, because then you'd come back and the guy who filled in for you, trust me, he was trying to do everything to either improve his ratings while he was on, to be better than yours, or he was like basically showing off and doing his absolute best on-air performance. And so the program director and the general manager would be like, hey, we should keep this guy on. And actually he's new and he doesn't have this really cool shift, and so he'll work for less money. We should have him do the shift instead of the guy that just went on vacation. And of course, if it was you that went on vacation, the sad part is that traditionally, the time before you went on vacation, you were usually pretty tired and you were ready for a vacation. So your performance on the air wasn't so stellar. So the last thing they remember is you sounding like you needed a rest. And then this new guy coming in, filling in for you, sounding freaking amazing. So that was the joke. Don't go on vacation for 2 weeks, because the guy that's going to take your shift will replace you. So that was a little about the radio gig I had here in on Earth, basically. So it was Boston. And as far as like flying around or going from station to station, I was pretty lucky. After I got done, or actually as I was finishing up my undergrad over at San Diego State, rebuilt that studio, put in a new mixing console, and it was the first replacement. Then I did a second replacement after I had a real job. But just before I was finishing up my bachelor's there, the station in Mexico that I was talking about, that we were cranking the power on, they switched format to a format that I loved. Before that, they were like kind of an urban oldie, or an old urban, in the sense that it was kind of like what they refer to now as old school. They didn't call it that back then, but it was sort of, it was actually pre-hip hop, or it was right around the time people were sort of transitioning from calling non-white dance music, instead of calling it house music, they were calling it hip hop. So they transferred from it being an urban station for the longest time into being alternative rock, but basically playing the hits of alternative rock that you hadn't heard. So the cool 80s songs that weren't being played were now being played, and it was 1992, 93, and so people were like, oh my God, that's great, I haven't heard that song in forever, and so they had an emotional attachment to it, so the station became pretty popular pretty quick. And we were competing with 91X, actually. Oh, and just so we're clear, it was 92.5 FM that was in town, XHRM. 92.5 The Flash was the name of the station. And so that's where I had my first real on-air gig as a DJ in a top 25 market. And I was 25 years old. And that had been a goal for me ever since I was, I think, 11 or 12. I'm like, I want to be on the radio in one of the top radio stations. And I didn't determine later on that I wanted it to be in the top 25. Because, you know, at that age, you don't really know, like, what top 10, what top 20, what top 100 markets means. And so after I learned what that meant, I was like, yeah, I want to be in the top 25. Because those are really good markets and people make money working in those markets. I was able to do that, and I was stoked. And so I would actually work from midnight to 6 a.m. there. I had the overnight shift, and my on-air name was Nick Summers. And no, I didn't say it that way. That's the way the promo said it. 92.5 The Flash, Nick Summers. But I would talk like I talk to you. I would talk like a normal person. With a little bit of energy, of course, you know. 92.5 The Flash, San Diego's Alternative Rock, with your buddy Nick Summers right here, and New Order off the 1986 Substance album would be something I would say. So I worked there from midnight to 6 a.m., basically Monday through Friday, meaning that I worked late Sunday night, right? So technically midnight, 12:01 a.m. To 6 a.m. Monday through Friday. And I would do that shift. I would leave the station about 6 or 6:30 after doing the crossover to the morning show. I would drive to a community college where I was taking my GE, my general ed. I would okay, just making sure. I would sleep in the car from about 6:30 till about 7:45, and then I would go to my 8 o'clock class, and then after that I would either go home at like 10:30 or 11, whenever that was over, or I would drive over to San Diego State, where I was taking the majority of my classes, because I transferred into San Diego State as a junior in electrical engineering, and then I would go over there and take my classes and then do my homework, and then at some point I would sleep. Usually I didn't, except in the car in the middle of the night. Every now and then I would, actually the majority of the time when I would get my longest amount of sleep, not the hour in the car, would be on the couches in the library. I would sleep probably in the afternoon, like if I had a class right after my, and I didn't do that every day, so it wasn't like I had classes every morning at 8 a.m. I think I had that like 3 times a week, and then the other 2 mornings I either but I didn't come home, because I'm like, if I come home, I'll never go back to school. So I would drive over to San Diego State and finish up my classes, and then like sleep in the library. So that was kind of cool. And while I was getting paid to be on the air as a DJ, and then I also picked up shifts on the weekends. And I'm happy to say that based on the ratings, because actually they don't rate midnight to 6 a.m. if you don't know. We play commercials at that time, but for the most part, we usually would throw those in as part of the advertising package. So like if a car dealer bought, you know, 100 spots or whatever, we would be like, okay, well, we'll give you 100 spots, but then we'll throw 20 in over the week, and we'll put them in various areas, and usually that was, you'd cram it in from midnight to 6 a.m. Or they would go commercial free, and, you know, so the guys that were up all night, the third shifters, which were my listeners, guys that were like stocking in the grocery stores, like in Vaughn's, guys working at 7-Elevens, people heading home would sometimes check in, and you know, like from the clubs and stuff, especially on like Thursday night, Friday night. I think Wednesday night maybe was actually college night in PB, so I would get a lot of like college students calling me, buddies that I would be going to school with, like from San Diego State or UCSD. I think that was Wednesday night or Thursday night, I don't quite remember. But so that was my gig at XHRM at 92.5 The Flash. And I even think I still have a bumper sticker from there. Yeah, I think I do. Yeah, I think I do. Cool. So I was on the air there, but then I was also volunteering with the chief engineer over there and just helping him out because I wanted the experience and I loved doing that, and it would be great because I could stay at the radio station longer. Because I just loved being at a radio station. It just felt, I got bitten by the radio bug when I was like 14 or 15. And I would sometimes just like, there were times where I would go to radio stations that had their on-air studio or their DJ booth with a window to the outside. And I remember sometimes just like standing outside that window, just like staring at the DJ on the air, mesmerized, like, oh my God, I want to do that so bad. That looks so cool. That guy is so cool. That girl is so cool. That's the coolest job ever. I'll do that for fun and for free. And that was definitely my first passion. Definitely my first passion was being in radio. And I also liked the technical side of it. I liked being on the air and being a ham and being fun and playing music. I love music. I still love music. You know, and I've DJed in nightclubs too. But what I would do is I would be doing engineering work, and we would do that in the studios that were here on this side of the border. But then every now and then we would go down to Mexico, and we would work on the transmitter down there. And so that's when me and the engineer got creative and figured out that, you know, at the end of the day, the FCC in Mexico, which is called the SCT, the Secretaría de Comunicación y Telecomunicación, they basically rarely came by your radio station to look at the logs to see if you were blasting out too much power or modulating over 105% peak or doing anything like that, or on frequency for that matter. And because the only time you ever like had a frequency shift issue, that was bad for you, because that meant people couldn't tune into it in their on their radio, so you would lose listeners. So you never wanted to go anywhere above off your dead center frequency. And you know, obviously you also didn't want to spill over into your, you know, even if it were your competition, you didn't want to crank into their frequency, because that would just sound like crap. But it would hurt you more than it would hurt the competition usually. So we would go down there, and I learned a lot down there. It was my first time ever in TJ, and we would, you know, and we would be doing work on the transmitter, sometimes shutting it off. So we would be there in the middle of the night. And other times when of course I was on the air midnight to 6 a.m., the engineer would be down there, and he would call me up, and he'd be like, okay, I'm going to tweak the processing. And, you know, it was like 3 in the morning, and very few people were listening. So I would literally play the exact same song 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times in a row. So that he could, like, you know, do a test on the quality of the song and be able to tweak it better. Now, even like a few years after that, you absolutely didn't do that as a DJ, because if you don't know, commercial radio, I don't know how it is now, I believe it's very similar, but commercial radio gets charged by the licensing, the music licensing boards, if you will. So ASCAP, BMI, CSAC, and then Sound Exchange, which is the fourth one, that came about as part of the internet streaming. Before it was just ASCAP, BMI, and CSAC, and they would take the licensing. And so you would pay those agencies based on the amount of revenue you were generating for every song. But to waste the money that you would have to spend on each individual song, the last thing you wanted to do is play the same song over and over and over again, because we were basically wasting airspace by not playing other songs. And you would lose listeners, of course. But it was better. It was a better alternative than shutting the transmitter off, even though you would announce that ahead of time, so when people heard static, they wouldn't freak out like there was a Holocaust or something. We would test that. So that would be cool. Even when I was not down in Mexico, I would still help out the engineer when I was in the studio. So that was really cool. I loved that. And it was a time in my life where, I mean, everything was clicking. I was doing well in school. I was at least 25, because I know I was at least a year sober, and I was at least a year sober. That was actually the best thing in my whole life, because I never thought I would be able to stop using drugs and alcohol. So that was a huge, amazingly wonderful time in my life. I was newly sober, and everything was like, oh my God, I get to live one more day. Gratitude and love, and, you know, a lot of people maybe in the program, if you will, you might hear them call it a pink cloud, which I think is bullshit. because there's no way you should label it negatively, and usually they label it a pink cloud, like, oh yeah, well that's just a pink cloud, that's going to go away. Absolutely not, dude. You can live the dream every single day of your life if you have a good enough perspective and the willingness to want to be willing, in my experience. But so that was an amazing time in my life. So anyway, I just wanted to share some of that. I'm actually going to continue on with the story in a little bit here, but I wanted to give the camera a rest. I wanted to make sure it was still recording. And I wanted to remind you that it's not always sunny in Southern California, but, you know, with a good enough perspective, I'm blessed to be able to live the dream every single day. And I hope you're living the dream. I hope you're safe and happy wherever you are, because if you're not living the dream, you're doing it wrong. Talk to you soon. Ciao.